Fantastic. So let's get started. So I'm very proud to introduce and have with us Luke Lascaris. So Luke Lascaris is a young social media influencer, digital media consultant, and a creative photographer. An avid user of the social media platform Twitter, he has engaged many other young people on issues such as elections, governance, civic responsibility, constitutional reform, creatives and the orange economy, LGBT plus issues, as well as issues and challenges facing young people in Barbados. He's the co-publisher of Barbados Magazine, a publication focused on Barbadian culture, heritage, entertainment, and cropover, which he has run since 2015. When Luke is not busy online engaging with his community or curating content, he spends his time as a proud uncle of his niece and nephew, as well as being a cat dad of a lovely feline. A proud Comber Moranian, Luke looks forward to one day becoming the president of Barbados and usher in a new age in Barbados in the twilight of his life. Luke, please take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction, Isaac. I want to thank you to Caribbean Links for inviting me on here. Everybody can hear me clearly, right?
Yes, we can.
So. Okay, just making sure. Okay, yeah. So just to start off this evening, what I'm here to speak about is the process of Barbados becoming a republic. As we all know, that Barbados became a republic last year, November 30th in 2021. We were originally a constitutional monarchy, a parliamentary constitutional monarchy, and we decided in 2020, in our 2020 throne speech, to change over to become a republic. And this is, like I said, we moved away from being a constitutional monarchy, and we decided that the type of republic we wanted to become would have been a parliamentary republic. So this would have been a direct change and a complete break away from the British monarchy and United Kingdom. And we've had about, I think it's around 300 years of direct rule from the British. I think it was 2-something. And then we had successive indirect rule from 1966. So Barbados was a colony originally. We became independent in 1966. And we still held on to Elizabeth II, Queen Elizabeth II, as our head of state after we became independent. So it would, like, if you're new coming into it, like I found out at university, it was strange to know that you were independent and that you still held on to the monarchy as your head of state. So Queen, which is very strange. It was just very strange to me, I'm sorry. So even though she was a ceremonial head of state, she was still our de facto head of state. And the question of republicanism has lingered in the air since 1966. So we wanted, like I said, we wanted to move on. We moved on to become a republic in 2021. We became the youngest republic in the world in 2021. We replaced Queen Elizabeth II with our then Governor General, now our president, the most excellent Dame Sandra Mason. And she became our first president, our first native head of state. And she was elected indirectly by our electoral college. So yes. So while Dame Sandra is our head of state, Mia Motley remains our head of government. So she leads the government and all the government business, and Dame Sandra has become our ceremonial presidential head of state. So yeah, like I was saying, us becoming a republic was a long process. It is something that was not new to us. It is an idea that has been floated around since 1966, since we became independent. It was said that our first prime minister, the Right Honorable Barrow, he wanted to become a republic in much a similar way that as other people have done. He didn't want to go through the independence process. He wanted to jump straight to a republic, but he was aware that Barbadians did have, there's a saying in Barbados, growing up stupid under the Union Jack. Barbadians did have quite an affinity for the monarchy back in those days, back in 1966. So he had been cautioned against making a move. So he went to independence because he knew that there was the especially post the Federation, there was the move towards islands self-governing, directly managing their own affairs and charting their own destiny. So he chose independence. It was much like us becoming a republic now. It was tumultuous at the time. It was not harmonious. Everybody didn't agree that we should become independent. Some Barbadians would have preferred that we had remained a colony. So he was our first prime minister, our father of independence. And around that same time, around the same 1966, going up into the 70s, we had constant conversations about this post-colonial Barbados, our Barbadia identity, and then in cementing that identity, what would it look like for Barbadians, especially in terms of our governance? Because we did become independent, but in maintaining the head of state, our colonial head of state, it asks questions about who we are and what's our direction and what is it that we are really actually trying to say when we become independent and still hold on to our colonial masters. So, like I said, I lost my train of thought. So yes, I know that Barbados did move into becoming a republic last year, 2021. It captured headlines by becoming the world's youngest republic and escaping the grasp of the British monarchy and establishing itself and its new direction and its new course. And people called it the end of the independence project that Errol Barrow has started. So now, in becoming a republic, we achieved full self-governance. We had our full head of state. We already had self-governance. Like, there was no interfering by the United Kingdom government or the monarchy in our internal affairs, but there were constant questions stretching back across time about what did the monarchy mean to us, especially if you have this head of state, this old white woman sitting out in a castle in England, in London, and she doesn't have any interaction with us. She doesn't say anything to us. She doesn't interact with us. She doesn't come and meet the people. She doesn't travel down here. So it was like, well, what is the purpose? Why are we clinging to this beyond just, oh, it's not a problem, let's just leave her there? So as an independent nation, we got to set our own laws. We set our own policies. We directed ourselves. It was internal self-rule. But it was, I found that, and a lot of Barbadians found that there was a type of schizophrenic nature to it, because while we were so independent and we were moving on towards like charting our own destiny again in the post-colonial period and charting out what the Barbadian identity meant away from the Union Jack and what is the broken trident mean to us and what does the flag represent. It was strange to still have all our senators, all our government ministers swear allegiance to the crown and swear allegiance to Her Majesty and all her successors. So especially as we moved on, we had our own constitution, our own laws, like I said, our own ministers. So there was the constant question of what is to become of us. So there were, again, a republic was nothing new. It started off as early as the 1970s, 1979 to be specific, with the Cox Commission by Mencia Cox. The government obviously was very cognizant of the fact that there was a drive towards republicanism. So they got together a commission, the Cox Commission on the Constitution, to ask the question of what does a republic look like? What would it look like for Barbados? What type of republic will we become? And the direction that we will go in. So the Cox Commission ultimately did decide that we should not abandon, this is 1979, we should not abandon our constitutional monarch, because that was the feeling of most Barbadians, but it did make a lot of recommendations as to what our future possible republic could look like. What would it be saying to us? What would it be for our people? And what would it be like then to escape the clutches of the British monarchy and the United Kingdom, and even also internal ideas that we held about ourselves as Little England. So this idea, even though the Cox Commission did strike down the concept of Barbados being a republic, or it didn't shelve the debate didn't go away. So it still continued up throughout the 70s, the 80s, and in the 90s, there was another commission, the Ford Commission, because again, the government was still very cognizant of the fact that a lot of Barbadians were very interested in the idea of becoming a republic. And again, swearing loyalty to the Queen was not in line with how we should see ourselves as an independent people, writing our own laws, having our own courts, having our own justices. And we have a governor general representative that is there. And even though she would be in place, like you see her pictures hung up everywhere at a lot of government offices, she was still at the end of the day a representative for the Queen. So the Ford Commission was settled in 1996. And in 1998, the Ford Commission was a review commission that looked at the Constitution. It looked specifically at the Constitution and what would be required for Barbados to become a republic. So the Ford Commission in 1998 recommended that we adopt a parliamentary republic system and that we move to hold a referendum on the issue of becoming a republic. So while unlike other nations, Barbados in its constitution never gave explicit instructions that a referendum must be held for us to become a republic. So, but still, a referendum is the best way of deciding what the public's mood was towards the issue. I think governments at the time were very cognizant of the fact that there was still an internal drive to becoming a republic, and it was something that still people were still very interested in, and that it would not go away, and that it wasn't something for governments to decide. It was something that should be put towards the people. I mean, because at the end of the day, this is a democracy. So I think it was also a bit of laziness on parts of the government, where they didn't want to be seen as the one who brought down the acts, and because they have a lot of older bases of power who really and truly, some older Barbadians would prefer if we had remained a colony. So they knew their base, and it is possible that you could offend your base by just making a unilateral move towards becoming a republic. There was also the other element that these governments often did not have, even though in 1996 and 1998, the Arthur government would have had the amount of power necessary to make the change towards the constitution. I believe he had 2/3 majority. There's a possibility, maybe wrong, but he did have enough power that it was not as tilted against his favor. But the Ford Commission did make the referendum that we hold a republic, and successive governments did promise referendums over the years. So even though the Ford Commission made a recommendation in 1998 and the idea was tabled in 2000 in Parliament, it never got any further. And there was ultimately an election held in 2003, I believe, and the whole concept of the referendum just went straight out the window, and nobody really bothered about it anymore. But again, the Ford Commission had lasting effects, and the idea of becoming a republic, again, did not go away. So you would have the conversations around republicanism and referendums keep coming up. You had it in 2000, you have it in 2005, you had it in 2008, you had it in 2015, you had it in 2016, and you had it right up until the 2020 Mia Mottley announcement. Not announced, Mia Mottley's announcement, the throne speech by Dame Sandra Mason, who would have been then our Governor General. So she made the throne speech announcing in 2020 that Barbados would become, this was September 2020, I believe, Barbados would become a republic in November 2021, November 30th, 2021. And Mia Mottley was able to make this sweeping change because in the 2018 election, the Barbados Labour Party, which is the ruling party now, won all 30 seats. And so they held the majority in the lower house. Eventually, Joseph Adderley defected, so they had 29, but they held the majority. They held the majority in the upper house. So it's easy to pass the constitutional amendment necessary to change over to becoming a republic. But she didn't go the referendum route because I think, personally, I believe Mia Mottley wanted to secure her legacy as the mother of the republic. as the same way that Errol Barrow has been seen as the father of independence. So she made a unilateral move. She made what Bajans have described as a big jump, and she decided that we would become a republic. And it was different from the ways that, like before, Commission had recommended that we become a republic. Republics usually are the change to republic is the last thing that happens after constitutional reform. But Mia Mottley did it in a different way. She didn't have a referendum, and two, she decided that she would do constitutional reform after we became the republic. So this, like I said, it was a unilateral move. She had the majority in both houses, and so we made eventually a big step to becoming the world's youngest republic, the parliamentary republic, in November 2021. And it, like I said, it was the completion of Errol Barrow's independence project. It was what many people saw as something long time in coming, long standing in coming. I think most people can agree that it was not something that, I guess it would not be in the way that most people would have liked. I've heard BLP stalwarts saying this, that the BLP normally does things in certain ways, but that Mia just decided to make the jump straight into a republic status, and she really has cemented her legacy. And the question going forward now is, what now after we've become a republic? Because we are now writing our constitution. So she did it in a strange way where she kept a lot of parts of the constitution. So effectively, the old constitution before we were a republic still exists, and it's now going through the reform. And then after we have decided on that constitution and the RSAT, the Republican, I can't remember what it means, Republican Status Transition something committee, they deal with reform of the constitution and what the move to republicanism means. So after they're finished and the constitution, our new republic constitution is laid before Parliament, and the day that Parliament enacts the constitution is the day that we will become a republic. So that day has not come yet. So there's the mistaken idea often that people have that November 30th is our Independence Day, and it also is our Republic Day, but that's not the case. We don't have a Republic Day as yet because we don't have a new Republic Constitution. So obviously the whole idea, the move towards Republic, like I said, it was very popular, but while it was welcome, there were a lot of questions where people felt that they had been left out the process, that it hadn't been done in the right way. Again, we don't have a requirement in our constitution, like some islands. I believe Jamaica has a requirement for a referendum. I believe Antigua has it too as well. We don't have that requirement. So we didn't have to go through that process because, again, that would have been a very hard process. It would be a hard process for any Caribbean country because even though young people want to become republics, they don't know. It's the same thing that would have happened or people believe would have happened did we have a referendum is what sort of happened now, in that the government just said we are becoming a republic and there was no talk about it. Like the throne speech came out, said we become a republic, and that was the end of the conversation. Like there was no sensitization or educational program where people explained, okay, this is a republic. This is what a republic means. This is what it means for the economy. This is what it means for your daily life. This is what it means for our standing on the international stage. This is the reason why we chose to do this. This is why we have this conversation. This is why we chose this time now. None of that happened. It just was the throne speech. So I think a lot of, usually throne speeches come out around the same time, but people were blindsided by the announcement, even though you heard murmurings that something big was coming, and then the announcement came out. And some other large ones, like regarding same-sex, I believe, was partnerships or marriages, even though that was rolled back. But it was a process that people felt that they were not included in. The referendum was one point of it. The educational aspect of it was another point of it. And so people felt as though it was not democratic, which led to some people saying that Mia Mottley was a dictator, but I would not agree. I mean, she exercised the power that was available to her as the head of government, and she made a choice unilaterally that a lot of people just either didn't want to make, didn't have The political backative did not have the willpower, and she made a choice that she believed was the best for us as a people. And it was the culmination of many acts that had happened before, similar to how Barbados has the CCJ as its final court of appeal, whereas a lot of other Caribbean nations who have signed on to the Treaty of Chaguaramas have not ratified it as yet and have not moved away from the Privy Council as their final court of appeal. So, including, I believe, Trinidad, where the court is located. But so it was a long process in a lot of progressive steps that Barbados has taken for itself. But ultimately, I could understand the critiques where people were saying that they did not feel included in the process, and as such, in the way that they were not educated about it, they felt left out by it, and they felt left behind by the entire process. So in closing, I just want to say that I believe personally, the change to a republic was something that was much needed. It was long vaunted. It was much spoken about. It is nothing new to Barbadian society. It's nothing new to anything that we've ever thought about or talked about. It is not a brand new concept that me and Motley pulled out of thin air. It is something that we've gone over for quite some time. And even though this process was a bit ham-fisted, it was inelegant in its execution. It ultimately is the road that we've chosen. It is the way that we've gone, and we're a republic, and that remains the end of the program. So that brings my presentation to a close. And I leave the floor open, I guess, after the presentation to any questions or queries. I think I saw one come up just now.
Thank you. Can everyone give him, like, everyone's at home, but could you give him like an applause?
Right.
No, thank you. That was really helpful to understand the history. I think a lot of times when things happen, especially where history might not be as documented, people in the public eye, that is, people don't realize that these things have always been happening. These movements are not random and overnight. They're sort of 100-year-long processes, and eventually they're happening in the modern age, but they have always been happening across the whole region. So thank you so much. I'm sure people are going to have questions at the end, so people have a lot of questions for you. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to hand over to the Caribbean Links team.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Luke. I am now going to introduce the amazing Professor Rosalie Hamilton, and I'm going to read out Professor Hamilton's bio. Professor Rosalie Hamilton is CEO of the Lasco Chin Foundation since June 2018 and Chair of Caribbean Philanthropic Alliance since 2019. She was Vice President at the University of Technology, Jamaica, 2008 to 2018, and was awarded a professorship in the Scotiabank Chair in Entrepreneurship and Development. She established and led the MSME Alliance, a network of small business organizations, for 10 years. She also established the Institute of Law and Economics and worked as a consultant and public educator on trade, governance, gender, and other areas of economic and social development. She has taught at the graduate and undergraduate levels in Jamaica and the US. She was Special Advisor and Trade Policy Consultant in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, 2000 to 2003, and served as Chief Advisor to the Prime Minister of Jamaica, May 2006 to September 2007. She is currently a board director for LASCO Manufacturing Limited and the National Integrity Action. She was recently appointed as the Honorary Consul of the Republic of Sierra Leone in Jamaica. Wow. Can we please all give a huge, warm Caribbean Links welcome to Professor Rosalie Hamilton?
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks, Luke, for that nice overview of what's happening in Barbados. I want to start my presentation with a definition of the Republic, just to clarify some of the issues I think Luke raised and what's really happening in Jamaica and why we're taking the position we're taking with respect to republicanism. So the essential character of a republic is rooted in the idea of people sovereignty. And I want us to not forget that, because too often it's associated only with the idea of the removing the monarch as head of state. So when we're talking about people's sovereignty, we're really talking about what Abraham Lincoln referred to as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And if we go to the root of the word republic, it's a Latin word, res republica, and it's the concept of a public thing. So the idea of a republican government is one where a country considers itself as a public matter. The running of a country, the operation of a country is a public matter. It's not a private property as is associated with the monarchical rule, where, you know, the monarch sees the country as it's belonging to them. And it's important to think about it because, you know, we talk about the motherland and so on. Those ideas come from a monarchical idea that, you know, this monarch owns and controls and is in charge of a country. And so that conception is important. And we've been focusing a lot on that in Jamaica because we think that it is important as we move to a republic that we kind of have concrete in our heads that we're talking about a form of government in which the nation belongs to the people and the people must take ownership, not of the country, not as tenants or you know, we talk about the idea that we're not just residing in a country, but we own the country. And that's what people's sovereignty means. And so there are other kind of, if we look at the history in the region, you know, we just heard about Barbados' move, but, you know, Dominica, Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago have all moved to become republics. And what you saw in that move was essentially the move to remove the head of state, the monarch as head of state, and the inherited structure of government remain the same. And what we see as common across all these Caribbean countries is the concentration of power in the hands of the executive. And that hasn't really changed. And you kind of heard that in what Luke was saying about, you know, Maya had the power, so she did it, you know? And so it was an expeditious move. And for those of us who agree fully that that move was necessary, we agree. But the process does matter, because if it is that a republic belongs to the people, then the people ultimately must make these big, important decisions. And importantly, must be involved in the day-to-day decisions in some ways, either indirectly through your representative or directly in forms that we can talk about. So that's basically this concept. There are two elements working together: a state without a monarch, that's one concept, but also importantly, and what is usually lost, is the idea of a state where the people are sovereign. And so if we think about what is involved in the former, it's a fairly simple legal constitutional process. You go through the steps as implied in the law and you change the monarch. The much more difficult piece is the piece of making people sovereign. And part of the difficulty there is the idea that we have a democracy. And, you know, in a democracy, you know, it's ruled by the people through their representatives in a representative democracy. So there's a confusion that, oh, we have that already, so let's just focus on the monarch. But again, as Luke was saying, you know, there's still issues about making people's voices heard in a democracy. And so we see it as simultaneously part of deepening our democracy and strengthening our democratic institutions. So I want to just then talk about what we're doing from these two perspectives. First perspective, the push to remove the monarch. Now, what happened at independence? Well, at independence, the dominant view was that mission accomplished. We had two major political parties, the PMP and the JLP, and the PMP led by Norman Manley, stated very explicitly in a speech, very famous speech that he did to the political party. And he said, the mission of my generation was to win self-government for Jamaica, to win political power, which is the final power for the Black masses. And he said, mission accomplished. And what was that mission? And that mission was to restructure the social and economic life of the Jamaican people. That's what he said. Now, we can debate that. I argue, of course, that that mission was not accomplished. We're still struggling with social and economic issues in Jamaica that we've inherited, quite frankly, since emancipation, right? When we look at housing conditions and so on, there are still issues we're grappling with. But from a political perspective of, attaining the realms of power, we did that, but it did not achieve what was intended. Now, Michael Manley was the intellectual leader of the whole self-government movement, and he openly accepted this British constitutional legal framework in which we operated. He said it openly that it's a familiar system of parliamentary government, and he actually, there's a quote that he said, it displayed the most unique genius of a people in history in devising a form of government that's acceptable to people. So he was gung-ho on this whole British constitutional monarchical arrangement, no problem there. Buster Manley also shared that view. And so by the time we got to independence, there was a bipartisan consensus around the Constitution, and we just simply put in the Constitution the leadership that existed of the monarch and to create this constitutional monarch. But the issue started to change by 1995 when a constitutional reform and elections commission was set up. And since 1999, when there was a joint select committee on constitutional and electoral reform that agreed on the recommendations of that commission. So we're talking about 27 years, more than 27 years. There's been a bipartisan agreement to remove the monarch as head of state. Now, the process includes holding a referendum, and that's in the Constitution. And therefore, unlike Barbados, no government, no leader, no prime minister could simply move us to a republic. And that's true because, and it's important because in spite of the fact that successive governments have put in their manifestos going into elections, national elections, they plan to move the Queen as head of state. You can look at all these elections for the past 3, 4, 5 years that we've had elections. They all agreed that they want to move the Queen, but it wasn't done. So fast track to what happened this year, or last year, I should say, Barbados became, had their referendum. Well, no, they didn't have the referendum, they became a republic. And since then, the debate resurfaced. And so Jamaicans start to say, oh man, it's taking too long. Why is it taking too long? And then that debate got intensified when the royals came to Jamaica. And that was in March of this year. And there was a whole slew of push and agitation and advocacy and protest against the visits that dovetailed the Republican agenda with reparations. And it started in Belize. The indigenous people started to, raise issues about indigenous people's rights, etc. In Jamaica, we did an open letter, just basically saying to the royals, listen, we have no reason to celebrate your grandmother's Jubilee, which is why they said they were coming to Jamaica to celebrate Jubilee and celebrate our independence. And we said, we'll celebrate the fact that, for 60 years, we are free of the British kind of thing. And importantly, we have reasons to celebrate that despite the odds, You know, we have become, you know, the best athletes in the world and musicians, and we're doing well, although we have a lot of problems, but we've overcome a lot of those barriers. Other countries in the region, Antigua, Barbuda, Bahamas, and so on, all reacted. And then there was another visit that you would recall in April, and again, a similar pushback. St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, also they had to postpone the Grenada leg of the tour. In fact, our agitation and advocacy continued over the Platinum Jubilee weekend. We had members of the Advocates Network who collaborated with Rachel Reed, an art advocate in London. Some of you may be aware of her work. She's famous for putting branding irons in the statues of, you know, King Charles and so on. And she had established a royal slavery exhibition in London, and we collaborated with her. We extended the reasons for apology and reparation to 10 more reasons. So we now have 70 reasons, and it includes what is happening with our Windrush population in Britain, and you know, basically saying, hey, reparations and apologies absolutely needed. So that's on the monarchical side. So that's where we are. We're pushing now to remove King Charles now as head of state. But on the other side of the people's sovereignty discussion, Jamaicans are beginning to ask the question, you know, how will removing the king affect the price of bread? How is it going to address these bread and butter issues that we have? You know, Jamaicans are concerned about escalating crime, you know, issues having to do with unequal access to education, landlessness, bad road infrastructure, etc. And so those are the day-to-day concerns. And so the question is asked, how will that improve governance and improve all these things? And we think that the push to strengthen the voice of the Jamaican people, the push to strengthen our democracy, and ultimately that push to make Jamaican people sovereign is what is key and is very much related to these concerns. These concerns are about improving living standards in Jamaica. And linked to that are the transformation of institutions that deal with education, health, all the issues that we're concerned about. The institutions responsible to deliver the quality of living standards that Jamaicans want is very much on the table in our heads. And that must be part of this transition to become a republic. So for example, the matter of accountability in the government, in the management of public funds, and effective oversight, right? These are key issues. You know, in Jamaica, we estimate about £1 billion, right? Over 100 billion Jamaican dollars is the cost of corruption annually. That's 5 to 7% of our GDP. And so just on that note alone, if we improve accountability, improve our governance framework, the savings from the cost of corruption, lowering the cost of corruption can be redirected to addressing these quality of life issues. And so this is just one example. There's several other issues that we can talk about that can improve people's lives when we put people at the center of the governance arrangement and the structure of government that we're talking about in a republic. Importantly, we must also decolonize these institutions and build the self-confidence to create technologies and the industries of the future. That's the kind of focus we think is absolutely necessary and must dovetail with the removing of the monarch. So let me just wrap up by saying where we are now. So coming out of the agitation, you know, after Barbados became a republic, we've been pushing, and the Advocates Network, I can just say a group of individuals, organizations who are all concerned with these contemporary issues, you know, the education of our kids, gender-based violence, a range of issues that many of us are concerned about. And we see the direct link of the colonial past and how the foundations and the root cause of the problems we're seeing today are linked to those problems. And so we are all committed to ending the colonial arrangement, including the institutional legacies, and moving our country forward along the lines I mentioned earlier. So by January, the government agreed to set up a Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs. And the primary objective there is to reform the Constitution and to enable Jamaica to transition from a constitutional monarchy to a republic. And that's basically what they said in January of this year. Now, by March, the Prime Minister announced in Parliament that he's going to set up an advisory committee, and it would include bipartisan representatives to advise the government on this move to a republic. Just a few days later, he announced in his very famous words to the Duke of Cambridge, William, we're moving on. And the whole world heard that. We're moving on from March. In June, the minister with responsibility for legal and constitutional affairs, Minister Malahoo Fort, she, in her sectorial presentation to Parliament, announced that there were going to be this comprehensive constitutional reform, and she's going to establish a constitutional reform committee, and she'll keep everyone informed on the progress. And to date, we've heard nothing since June the 7th. So the Advocates Network has just this week put out a press release. We're basically saying it's time to move on. It's time to move the king as head of state. And we're calling specifically for the immediate establishment of the Constitutional Reform Committee that was promised since June, to begin to inform the public about what this reformation of the Constitution will entail. How will the people's voices be heard? We also demand and are pushing that the government starts a public education process to inform the Jamaican people about the process of becoming a republic and the importance of constitutional reform and what this referendum will mean. And again, it's the kind of thing that Luke pointed to. The people were not so much understanding perhaps what exactly is involved and what does it really mean. And we feel that this is something that we must do. And so we're pushing for that. In fact, the Advocates Network have already started. We've started our own public education program. We've done 3 sessions so far. We're about to do a 4th where we're talking to the public. We invite, it's an open forum, anyone can come on, and we're talking about this whole move to become republic. And the last thing we said is that the government must table the required legislative bills in Parliament that's required to remove the king, and it must be done. We're pushing for it to be done before our 61st celebration of our independence, and that is on or before August 6th, 2023. And that's where we are. A group of us that are part of the network and others in the society are now engaged in a very lively debate about what this republic ought to look like and to begin that process as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Rosalie, for that incredibly interesting speech. Can we please give a huge Caribbean Links clap to Professor Rosalie? Thank you so much, Professor Rosalie. I thought it was really important that you spoke about actually explaining what a republic would mean to everyday citizens, and also just generally educating people and letting people know and understand what that actually means for them in their everyday lives. So thank you so much for that. I'm now going to pass over to the Caribbean Links team, as we are now going to go into our section of the event where it will be about audience questions. So I'll pass over to the Caribbean Links team. Thank you so much.
Hello. So one of the first questions that we have here is, what benefit is it to be a republic as opposed to independence? Is it just to say that it was done economically? Is there an impact?
Is that for me?
Yes, and it'd also be great to hear from Luke as well.
All right. I certainly I see two kinds of important differences. As I mentioned in our case, in the case of independence, I see it as unfinished business. Our main advocate for self-determination made it very clear that he felt the mission was accomplished. But when we look at the social and economic conditions of the Jamaican people, there's still much to be done. 20% of our population is squatting. We have an education system that we describe as an apartheid education system in Jamaica. And it's just a massive, comprehensive study that was done, chaired by Professor Orlando Patterson from Harvard University, detailing the issues there. A lot to be done there. There is the matter of the legal framework. We're still going to the Privy Council for justice, and we have a Caribbean Court of Justice. Those issues are still unsettled. We have a range of other issues. Crime is a problem, and so on. So these issues of how do we put a governance arrangement in place to address these issues is still unfinished. So although we had independence, and what it effectively did was to put the key elements of government in the hands of the Jamaican people. So we have the head of government is a Jamaican, and we have a range of institutions in place that are run by Jamaican. But what we see is after 60 years, there are still not just remnants in some cases, but significant institutional legacies that persist. Let me point to one that was truly troubling, and it was a wake-up call for a lot of Jamaicans. So in the throes of the Black Lives Matter movement, when the world saw a white man standing on the neck of a Black man, killing him in front of the cameras, Jamaicans woke up to an insignia that our Governor General was wearing. And there was a picture of a white angel standing on the head of a Black man. And our Governor General in 2020 was wearing that insignia. And it in my mind, it just demonstrates the unthinking perpetuation of institutional norms. Those things must end. So that's what we see. And that's why we dovetail the idea that this is not just about moving the king. Moving the king is about ending an old, inhumane, very wicked colonial relationship. That needs to end, just for the sovereignty and the dignity of our people. But beyond that, we have to finish the business that we started from emancipation of full freedom, and in the case of independence, full self-determination. We have to finish that business.
Thank you. Luke, do you have anything to add? Or should we go on to the next question?
Could you refresh me on the questions? I was engrossed in the answer.
Yes, of course. The question was, what benefit is it to be a republic as opposed to simply having independence? Is it just to say that it was done, and economically, is there an impact? From Barbados, it must be interesting to hear this happening, obviously very recently.
Right, exactly. Because that's similar to Professor Rosalia. That is what the question that people had. What would be the impact for the person on the street? Does it change the price of bread, the price of gas still going up? Like, what does this mean for us? I think to echo her as well again, is about self-determination of a people, and it's about now starting to dismantle structures that would have been constructed and solidified during the colonial period, so that this is what people understand, like people, these things like that are so interwoven into the educational system. For example, there was just a whole ruckus with here in schools. There was two separate and distinct people talking about it on Twitter, but it's a conversation that has been going on for a long time. And it's the juxtaposition that you celebrate Black History Month when the Americans celebrate it in February, and you do African awareness, and you make children wear dashikis to school and try to teach them very trite facts about their history and African inventors, and let them wear out their hair and do all this type of stuff. But then in the day-to-day, throughout the other 11 months of the year, you're telling children coming to school with natural hairstyles for a country where the hair grows out of their hair naturally for about 98% of the population, that this hair is not good. But you see Indian, you see Caucasian children, full hair flowing going down to their shoulders, and there's never any critique or complaint. But you can't wear afro, you can't wear hair beyond a certain height, you can't have certain haircuts. This applies to both men and women. So I say all that point to encompass that there's so much work still yet to be done. Like, reaching a republic is not the end of the road. It is about charting the way forward for us, and it's not just for us, it's for our children. Charting the way forward for us as a people and the direction that we go in. It's like, it's fine to say, I get the concept that it's like, you know, with the queen and harm in the body, was she in trouble in the body, where you don't laugh, she did the system. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But it's like, we need to understand who we are as a people, B, what our history is, C, what direction we are looking to go in. Because if you are having this monarchy, this family that nobody has elected, while you are living in a democracy, this family lording over you and having potentially the power to literally to revoke your constitution, there is a danger in that. And it is about, again, the way forward. And these concepts might seem, because they're not material, they're intangible. You know, it seems like you could just, you're making a fuss about nothing, but it's about making a way forward for our people. It's about understanding where we are going. It's like putting things in place so that the injustices that have faced our people from independence up to now are not carried forward into the future. And I hope that in saying all that, that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. Thank you. I think there's a very interesting element of what in the modern age is soft power when it comes to the British royal family.
Yes.
And, there was a really interesting TikTok that I saw, and a woman was talking about, I think she was British, and she was talking about how the fact that the whole world is watching this one family. You know, I had colleagues that are in places like Germany, and they said every channel in Germany, or the main channels, had the Queen's funeral on, and all these different things. And these are countries that have had their own monarchies. So that tells you that the PR of this one family is very powerful. And that leads me into the next question. So given the way that bipartisan politics work in the Caribbean, what can be done to ensure that voters do not simply vote the way that a specific party persuades them to?
So which of us should start first, me or Professor Rosalia?
You can go ahead if you'd like.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just start because I'm here. In bipartisan, I mean, traditionally in Barbados, we've had more than one party. I mean, no, it is. I really can't say no that there are two parties, because we are effectively a one-party state. We don't have any opposition. Like in the last election, like I said, we had 130 seats. Joseph Adderley defected. He became opposition leader. This time around, in this election at the beginning of this year, I think it was 19th of January, we had 130 seats again. Nobody defected. We are one-party state. So I was trying to remember the question. Isaac, can you remember? Could you pull it up for me?
Yes, it was simply just asking what can be done to ensure that voters don't simply vote the way that a specific party persuades them to, especially with a lot of people, if they're in certain villages or certain towns and everybody votes that way. they always vote that way. They, irrespective of almost what happens, that always happens. So what could be done to ensure voters can ultimately exercise their own minds, really, and try and break free of that system, especially when it comes to something like this?
Well, I guess this would be more a question for Professor Rosalia, but what I will say is that we, in terms of like rigid divisions where that was something that happened in the past, definitely, and within families. So people would say, oh, your aunt is a B, your mother's a B, your father's a B, ergo you must then automatically become a B. Or, you know, this neighborhood, this village down here, this is a B stronghold. So this means that this will lead the way into a particular constituency going a certain way, or this particular area, this box is going to go towards the B's, or it's going to go towards the D's. But that mindset is now moving away. Obviously, more younger people are getting into politics. We have new systems that interfere. Interfere is really the wrong word, that interact with our social structure. So it's not just like, let's say in 1966, 70, there's no social media, it's just TV that's run by the state and by the ruling party. And you get your stuff from word of mouth, or when you go to the market or whatever, or the newspaper. But now you have different people. Like I could talk to somebody in St. Lucie and I'm saying that at home. So it's like there are different ways of organizing. There are different ways of people communicating. There are different ways of people interacting. So this has led to a shift away from these particular type of this neighborhood is a B neighborhood type of thing, where people are now becoming, especially we saw in the last election, a lot more rigorous around what somebody in one area votes in or somebody in another area votes in, where candidates are more starting to have their feet held to the fire, for these issues not to happen. And I guess if I were to take that and relate it towards the Republic issue, that is actually a very good question, but again, because the strongholds are being broken up, or areas are no longer seen as a stronghold or not a stronghold, and that there were deep questions about the Republic having a certain, I mean, yes, you would have vote buying and stuff like that, but ultimately I found that because they didn't inform people too much about what was going on, and people didn't know, and I again, the question lingers in the air as to whether that would have happened if it had been put towards a referendum. But it would depend on who wanted it to go where, as in who wanted it to move towards a referendum, who wanted it to remain as independent. And throughout the political ages, again, from the Cox, coming up past the Cox, up towards the Ford Commission, both parties had agreed that they would want to move towards a referendum, to move towards a change to Republic status. So I think that ultimately we would still have ended up here anyway. But again, I believe this question is more suited to Professor Rosalia, where Jamaica now has to go through that process, and what is the way that they will navigate that.
You know, I think there are two things. How the question is posed in the referendum, and if it's coupled with other questions. Because remember, both parties pretty much agree to removing the monarch as head of state. There are important details like, do we move to a ceremonial presidential arrangement or an executive one? And that's where you now get issues, and it can get politicized. In fact, over the years, there was that disagreement from in the 90s, where the PMP held the view that it should be an executive president, and the JLP had the view that it should be a ceremonial president. Over time, they came to an agreement that the Governor General, the president would look pretty much like the Governor General, which today has both executive and ceremonial duties. And so that kind of compromise led to this agreement of both parties. So again, it depends, because if they put that issue to the voters, and many argue they should, whether it should be ceremonial versus executive, then you could get that debate, and you could get that part by partisan kind of divide. I think if both parties campaign together on the issue, this would be kind of historic that Jamaicans would go to an election in which both parties agree on the same thing. And I think it's an opportunity to unify a highly divisive, politically divisive country. So we argue that we ought to find a way to use the referendum as a way to bring the countries together, the country together. And we're hoping good sense will prevail. Jamaica is, quite divisive. There are lots of issues, lots of tension. No, we think that would be a great way to bring people together. And the second point is that with effective public education, we can also offset that issue, where we can, make the case that a referendum is to hear the people's voice, not the party's voice. And if we make that case effectively and people understand that this is an opportunity for you to vote what you want, not what a party wants, then I think we can overcome it. But it is a concern that many of us have, and we're very mindful of it, and we're going to advocate around that issue.
Thank you. Just have a follow-up question for you. What has the response been from the Republic in relation to the educational talks that you've been giving? And how have you given them? Have you gone to kind of villages, towns, or have you invited people to come and see people speak?
So just from a methods perspective, we've been mainly doing it online. 2 reasons, the COVID-related reasons, there's still an issue. As we move away from that COVID regime of, doing a lot online, we are now beginning to organize on-the-ground sessions. There's, of course, the cost related to that, and that is a challenge. That's one of the reasons we've been pushing for the government to organize these events, because they obviously have more resources than us as NGOs and volunteers as we are in the Advocates Network. So, but the ones we've had online and we've done our polls and so on, the feedback is that the persons who come to our online forums have found it interesting. They have shifted positions. We've picked that up, from our polls, where we asked them their views coming in and so on. And we also have deepened the conversation. So Jamaicans are now asking very good questions, whether it's about the bread and butter issues, whether it's now about the type of presidency we want to move towards, etc. So we're getting good feedback, and we're seeing live people beginning. What is happening is there are very, let me just say, loose ideas associated with this republic. In some cases, and moving the monarch as head of state. In some cases, I've heard people say, well, if we move from, the king as head of state, we're definitely going to be losing something from the British. And we don't want to lose anything, and we don't think we can manage on our own. That kind of idea. And where does that come from? Well, it's not very clear. Some people associate what we're getting from the British is aid. Well, there's a lot of aid that Britain gives to countries who are not, don't have constitutional monarchs, and countries that, in fact, have never been part of the British Commonwealth. So that's not quite the reason you don't want to move. And conversations about the cost, et cetera, et cetera. So we're pleased with the feedback we're getting, and we have some evidence that learning is taking place and people are deepening their understanding and becoming more convinced. One more point on that. Part of the education process is to educate Jamaicans about our history. Most of us, not only in Jamaica and the Caribbean, has had a sanitized history, a kind of fairy tale view of the monarch and the queen. And there are a clear disassociation between the kind of monarch and so on, and their active role in starting and perpetuating the institution of slavery, the trafficking of slavery, and the enslavement of our ancestors. Now, when you begin to make that link, and when you begin to make the link of the wealth that have been created, and no comparable kinds of reparatory arrangements. And significantly, the fact that 20 million pounds was paid to our ancestors, and they only stopped paying in 2015. When people hear those facts, they said, what? And so that's beginning to wake people up and say, yeah, it's time. We definitely have to do it. And many people who are on the fence of reparations are now saying, yes, we absolutely must push. Because, most recently, the New Zealand's got some kind of a reparatory arrangement. And, we're just going to keep pushing. So education is key.
Thank you for that. It was really helpful. I think people don't see anything that has happened to us as Caribbean people as a debt. So, someone asked me, would I be watching, the funeral? And the funeral took place on my birthday. And I said, I'm not going to be watching the funeral of people who owe me things. Why am I going to be watching them? It doesn't actually make sense. Do you go to the house and have dinner with people who owe you money? No, you wouldn't. But people don't see it as something that you're owed. Obviously, it's not that necessarily that type of debt, but people don't see it in that way. There's a real misconception as to what has happened historically, even as Caribbean people, even in the diaspora. Luke, do you think that the public have the momentum to keep the progress that has started on this journey to being a republic moving forward? Do you think that the average Bayesian person can continue that momentum? Or do you think that it may need a kind of a boost perhaps from the government?
I definitely think it requires a boost. I think it's a constant ongoing conversation. I like to liken democracy to a constant ongoing conversation between a government and its people. And I think organizations such like Professor Rosalia's are important, and they help fill that space because unlike Jamaica, and we didn't have really people like her. I did some of it in Almond Magazine, where we described like what is the process to becoming a republic, like what does it mean, what changes and stuff like that. But we don't have people and organizations like hers that help fill the gaps, that help do the advocacy, that help do the work, that help explain, okay, this is where we came from, this is where we're at, this is where we're going, and this is what we're doing, stuff like that. But I definitely do believe that part of the role does belong to the government, especially coming up to the constitutional reform and the constitutional reform committee. Like all these pieces that you're putting into place, you need to constantly explain to people what is going on, what is happening, why you're doing it, why is it necessary, what does this mean, and what's the direction that we are going in, because it's not a government doing stuff by itself, which is a very old school traditional Bayesian idea that the government does stuff and you complain about it and then both you move on. No, this is a democracy. Like you doing stuff for us. Again, to echo a lot of what Professor Rosalia said, this is something for us. We're doing this together. This is, especially within a republic, it belongs to the people. It's for the people, by the people. So you're not doing this and then we figure it out afterwards. It's like you doing the stuff that we tell you to do. So if you're doing a republic now, if we are a republic now, then we need to have that conversation. Government needs to constantly have that conversation with us, hold our hands and go up the road together so we can figure out what's the direction that we're going in. So basically, yeah, the government needs to fill in that space and needs to fill in that gap and needs to maintain a constant education and a constant reaffirmation of the goal that we've achieved and where we're looking to go from here.
Thank you for that. There's just a follow-up question to that as well, for both of you. Is there an exchange of ideas established or going to be established so that each country can help the other? And I guess the region more widely, are there kind of across the region networks? It seems that the process of referendum is a learning process that maybe Barbados can watch and learn from Jamaica.
Honestly and truly, I believe that we definitely can learn from Jamaica and learn from other countries who have put forward referendums and who have done stuff. Like there's been a, again, because going back to the CCJ, we just went into the CCJ. I might be right. I don't think that we had a referendum on the CCJ. I think that we just ratified it as our final court of appeal. We didn't go through the bells and whistles, but watching Grenada, go through the referendum and watching the referendum to change the CCJ fail, and people would then look at that and say, oh, this is why we do things the way that we do it. But it is, no, there are reasons why you do referendums. Again, to echo Professor Rosalia, you are not a government operating by yourself, you're operating for the people. So you need to, it is an agreement. You need to go to the people and explain what's going on, ask them, is this something that you consent to? Yes, you have given us majority, or yes, you vote the same, but it's not, that doesn't mean that we are able to operate unilaterally. I get the sense of how me and Motley can do that because she has 30 seats, but generally, you can't just operate like that. So, yeah, I lost my train of thought. What was the question again?
The question was, effectively, can each country help the other, or
yes,
exchanges of ideas that have been established or are going to be established?
Yeah, definitely. I do believe that we could learn from Jamaica and other countries who will go forward towards the referendum. I don't know what we could help to contribute, but I don't even know if governments have that cross-channel communication, but definitely there's stuff that we can learn from it.
In fact, we've already created our Caribbean advocates links around the advocacy that came out of the royal visits. So we're constantly in touch with the representatives in the reparations commissions and individuals. I want to say also that we have a lot of young people who are part of the Advocates Network, and many of them young lawyers, as well as a Barbadian who's studying in Jamaican, and he too is part of the network. And so there is a lively conversation going in Jamaica with respect to the experience of the Caribbean.
Wonderful, wonderful. Independence has been described as a process. Do you think the Caribbean becoming a federation could be part of that process? Perhaps federating could strengthen us economically and politically.
Wow, that's a loaded question, only because of that history of federation. You know, I prefer to think about it as the regional integration movement. And the name sometimes confuse us and conjures up all kinds of emotions and so on. And I think, you know, the term, let's unpack that term. What does federation mean? What does regional integration mean? And at its core, it's about how sovereign nations will work and collaborate together to get things done. We've not done a great job with CARICOM. And I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. That too is unfinished business. But I think it's an important part of this path to self-determination, because in a highly competitive global marketplace where our strength comes from our numbers, not of population, but of sovereign territories. I think that's a valuable asset for us to leverage as we engage the world. And so we need to do a better job there. And, you know, I want to say that as a Jamaican, I'm not very proud with the efforts I've seen Jamaicans play within the region over the last few years, where we have taken positions that seem to be contrary to and in contradiction to the positions of the rest of the Caribbean. And the most recent one is what we saw with respect to the vote on the Commonwealth Secretariat position and the fielding of another candidate and so on and so on. I mean, you know, that if we chose to do that, as we have a right to as a sovereign nation, it ought to be done with the consensus and with an agreement and an understanding, even if you beg to disagree, you know, that it's done with an understanding. We shouldn't have prime ministers, you know, making very negative statements about another Caribbean country because they didn't hear about it or it wasn't done. It's just messy, 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 messy. And I think that's the kind of thing we must avoid. And we really have to work in a much, and I think to the extent that we can do what we're currently doing better, then we can and ought to consider deepening that collaborative arrangement and get into something that could look like the kind of federation that was envisioned, and certainly the kinds of things that we've been talking about as goals and aspirations in the CARICOM experiment.
I just had a follow-up question for both of you, actually, because I know education is a key for well, everything really. But in terms of the education that children have, especially now that governments within the Caribbean control the education system, which wasn't the case in, say, my grandma's day when she left Dominica, how is history explained, especially if it's in relation to monarchies, things like that? The world can obviously, through soft power, can present a sanitized version of the monarchy, and especially with the Queen being an elderly person, looking more like someone's grandmother, and she's like an elderly lady and everybody loves her. But of course, she's at the top of a very big tower. So how does the education system work in both Jamaica and Barbados in teaching children the role of monarchy, especially in the age of an absolute monarchy, and then perhaps the role of the monarchy within each island nation itself? What's the education like for children to understand history in a more accurate way as opposed to a sanitized way?
Well, I think we should pause a little and think about what education means in the modern world, because it's not just about what you learn in school anymore, because we all have access to the internet. So a lot of education is taking place on the internet. And so kids have the opportunity to go online and understand history in a way we didn't. Having said that, with respect to the curriculum and the way history is taught and demonstrated, because it's one thing to talk about a colonial past and sense of self, and as Luke pointed to, having these days where you celebrate African history and Black history and so on, but that in our day-to-day life and experience, we don't feel it. The kids in schools are still being discriminated against, I would argue, with respect to their hair. We have the same problem that Luke described in Barbados, in Jamaica, and it's there across the Caribbean. And so our education about our history is not simply what we have in school, but how we experience that education about, moving away from mental slavery, a word that we all use, made popular by Bob Marley and so on, and of course, Marcus Garvey, moving away from mental slavery, decolonize your mind, those kinds of ideas. What does it mean in real life, where young people still see and perceive a difference in the society if they're light skin versus black skin? So I think the education must go beyond what we learn in the history books. And yes, there are historians, many of them across the region. We have a historian leading the University of the West Indies, and they've done a lot of work, and they're continuing to work and to bring the history out. Yes, it must be taught in school, but importantly, throughout all our institutions, we have to live that history that we are independent people, that we must build the self-confidence, we must be proud of who we are, we must look in the mirror and not feel ashamed. That's the kind of living history that I think we must move towards.
Luke, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I again want to echo Professor Rosalia. I know that in schools, it's a very trite, because again, remember, I learned about the Queen as the head of state at university. I was already at university level. So that's when it was like fully explained to me that she is still our head of state, even though we have become independent. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. I remember my professor looking at me, he was a white man looking at me, a white English man looking at me, a little flabbergasted, like, like almost in a turn, how dare you? But it is glossed over very much in schools. And I wonder if we were to change the education curriculum or even edit it or alter it anyway, like how would you go about explaining that this one family you're not explaining all the ties. What's the ties between how they became so rich and so rich off countries like Barbados, and how slavery financed their wealth, and Barbados remained in a colony, financed their wealth, and even things such as the way even in post-slavery, in the post-emancipation period, when all the development, quote unquote, in Barbados was only structured to happen towards pointing wealth towards the mother country. So you had cases where wages froze for a number of years. At one point, they froze for 100 years. So all that types of stuff. So it's like, how do you distill that down into a very simple form for people's, for younger minds to accept that this is what happens? I think that even though our education system in Barbados is seen as very good, I find that those uncomfortable, they just don't like uncomfortable truths. So those truths like that to young children will be seen as a type of radicalization and a type of, Bajans are very conservative and conformative. So a type of radicalization against, there's the school of thought that these are things that we should let go and move past. But again, I want to echo Professor Rosalie in that this is stuff that not just needs to be taught in school, even if you do manage it to distill it in such a way that their minds could grasp and that you reinforce it going up through the years, but that is that we teach ourselves constantly outside of school, like in how we respond to one another, with how we see one another, with how we see and treat one another. If your hair is a certain texture, if your skin is a certain color, that this is the way in which then that I believe it will really truly have an impact on us then and the direction that we're going. So it's not just to be able to say in a wider perspective that, yes, that we move towards a republic, we're the world's youngest republic now, we're having a good time, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, what does this truly mean? And at a structural and an interpersonal level, like, how do we treat one another? How do we see one another? How do we move past these colonial ideas of darker skin or women in power and minority groups, LGBT people? Like, how do we let go of all these ideas and envision a world, a country that is better for all of us? And that's really it.
Thank you. And one last question, Professor Rosalie, you might be able to help with this. Are there any books being written at the moment or that have been written which cover these issues that you're aware of?
Well, you know, there are a couple, in terms of the current issues, they're literally evolving. I mean, I'm not sure if there's anything done with respect to what has happened since Barbados became a republic. A few that I'm trying to think if any comes to mind right away, but I am sure they're being written. But let me say that, you know, some of the older books that have been written still have relevance because the issues still persist. And so I think, you know, you go back to all the references, but perhaps some of you would have learned in school that, you know, have a deep dive in the Constitution and the kinds of issues that we're talking about, and many of them are still relevant.
Wonderful, thank you. So that brings us to the end of the event. Thank you to everyone for listening, everyone for participating. Major thanks to Professor Rosalie, major thanks to Luke for a wonderful history of Barbados and explaining what it's like on the ground, because we see these discussions on social media, lots of Western influence of what's happening, but it's great to actually hear about what's happening in the long histories to these moments, which are obviously completely swept under the rug by media. So now I'd like to hand over to Stacey for the final part of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Again, I just want to say thank you on behalf of the Caribbean Links team to Rosalie and to Luke for joining us and giving us such fantastic talks. And of course, thank you everyone for joining in and participating and being a part of this event today. I have just pasted in the chat box our Twitter and Instagram and also our YouTube channel. Please subscribe, please follow us and keep up to date with the events that we have planned as well. Thank you very much everyone for joining us, and please take care. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.